I hit a specific kind of rock bottom on an ordinary Tuesday, the unglamorous kind nobody makes a movie about. No dramatic loss, no public failure, just waking up at noon, phone dead, dishes piled in the sink, and a quiet sinking realization that I genuinely couldn't remember the last day I'd felt proud of myself. That afternoon I started digging into how a specific kind of man operates, the kind who seems to run circles around everyone else without ever looking rushed or frantic about it. Not luck, not talent nobody else has. A routine, repeated daily, boring enough that almost nobody bothers sticking with it long enough to see what it actually does. Here's the provocation that kept surfacing as I dug deeper, the one I genuinely wasn't expecting. Almost nothing about this routine involved adding things. It was built almost entirely out of subtraction. Fewer tasks, fewer inputs, fewer decisions, fewer things competing for the same finite attention. The same exact logic, it turns out, that quietly builds wealth also quietly rebuilds a man, and neither one seems to have much interest in more. I tested it myself, starting the very next morning, determined to rebuild one entire day from scratch using exactly what I'd found. What happened over those 24 hours changed considerably more than I expected from something this simple. The night before is where this whole thing actually starts, which surprised me, since I'd always assumed a great day began the moment you opened your eyes. It doesn't. It begins roughly 8 hours earlier, with a series of small, almost invisible decisions most guys skip entirely because they're tired and the bed is right there. I'd spent years treating the night before as a kind of dead zone, something to get through on the way to the part that actually mattered. Looking back, that dead zone was quietly deciding the outcome of the next day before I'd even fallen asleep. The same way the foundation of a house decides considerably more about its future than anyone notices while admiring the paint. I set an alarm considerably earlier than felt comfortable, charged my phone in the kitchen instead of next to the bed, and laid out exactly what I'd wear the next morning, down to socks. None of this felt significant doing it. It felt like the kind of overly organized behavior I'd have mocked a few years earlier. I did it anyway, mostly because I had nothing left to lose by trying. I'll admit there was a small, petty resistance happening internally as I did all this. A voice insisting this was the kind of thing only insufferable productivity types bothered with. I ignored the voice. The voice, it turns out, had never actually tried it either, which made its confident opinion considerably less credible once I stopped to think about it. The alarm went off, and, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't reach for my phone first. It wasn't in the room to reach for. I sat up, feet on the floor, and made the bed immediately, a habit that sounds almost insultingly small and somehow set the tone for everything that followed it. It took maybe 90 seconds, corners tucked, pillow straightened, nothing elaborate. But it was the first task of the day completed before the day had really even begun. A small, undeniable proof that I'd followed through on something. That proof sat there in the corner of my mind for the rest of the morning. Quiet evidence that today might actually be different from the version of me that had been losing to mornings for longer than I wanted to admit. A full glass of water before anything else, no coffee yet, no scrolling, just water, standing at the kitchen counter in the kind of silence I hadn't actually experienced in a morning for years. My body had apparently forgotten what it felt like to start a day without immediately being told what to think about by a screen. The silence itself was almost uncomfortable at first, the way any room feels strange when a sound you've grown used to suddenly stops. I kept glancing at the counter where my phone usually sat, half expecting it to be there, the way you reach for a railing on stairs you've climbed 1,000 times, even when there isn't one. Somewhere around the second or third sip, the silence stopped feeling strange and started feeling like something closer to mine. The absence of the phone in those first minutes did something I genuinely didn't expect. My own thoughts, completely unprompted by any notification or headline, simply showed up on their own, the way they apparently used to before every spare second got filled with somebody else's content. Some of those thoughts were useful, a few were uncomfortable. All of them were mine for the first time in a long stretch of mornings that technically belonged to me but never actually felt like it. It struck me later how identical this felt to a financial principle I'd read about years earlier and never fully applied to anything beyond a bank account. The idea that you don't get clarity by adding more options, you get it by removing the ones competing for space. A cluttered morning is just a cluttered budget wearing a different outfit. Dozens of small claims on a finite resource, none of them dramatic individually, all of them quietly expensive together. One thought in particular caught me off guard, an idea about a project I'd been quietly avoiding for months, fully formed. It was just sitting there in my head like it had been waiting patiently for an opening this entire time. I hadn't gone looking for it. It had simply been able to surface because nothing else was competing for the space it needed. By the time I'd finished that glass of water, maybe 4 minutes total had passed since the alarm went off. 4 minutes, and already the day felt structurally different from every other morning I could remember. The kind of difference that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't tried it and impossible to argue with once you have. The first hour was almost entirely physical, which struck me as strange at the time, since the part of my life that actually needed fixing felt mental and emotional, not muscular. I followed the routine anyway, mostly out of stubbornness, trusting that whoever had figured this out before me probably had a reason I just hadn't grasped yet. Movement came first, nothing elaborate, just 20 minutes of actual exertion before the day had a chance to talk me out of it with some more urgent-sounding excuse. Push-ups, a short run around the block, whatever got the heart rate up enough to genuinely feel it. My body, completely unused to this kind of request this early, protested loudly for the first several minutes before something shifted and the protest quieted into something closer to rhythm. I was embarrassingly out of shape, a fact my own lungs made clear within the first minute of that run, burning in a way that suggested they'd filed a formal complaint with management. I kept going anyway, slower than I'd have liked. Occasionally walking when running stopped being an option my legs were willing to negotiate on. Slow movement still counted as movement. That distinction mattered more than I expected it to. I genuinely hadn't expected the mental effect to arrive this fast. Somewhere around the 10-minute mark, the heavy fog that had been sitting on my thinking for weeks started lifting. Not completely, but enough to notice the difference clearly. Whatever chemical process was happening in my body apparently didn't care that I'd spent months convinced exercise was a luxury I didn't have time for. I'd built an entire identity somewhere along the way around being a guy who simply wasn't a morning workout person, the same way some men decide early on they're not math people and never revisit the claim. 20 minutes into a single sweaty, uncoordinated jog around my own block, that identity quietly started looking less like a fact about me and more like a story I'd just never bothered to test. The cold shower came right after, and I'll be honest, this was the part I'd been dreading since I first read about it. Standing there, hand on the faucet, every instinct screaming that this was an unnecessary form of self-punishment invented by people with too much free time. I turned it anyway, gasped audibly enough that I'm fairly sure a neighbor heard it through the wall, and stood under genuinely uncomfortable water for a count that felt considerably longer than it actually was. I negotiated with myself the entire time, the way you'd negotiate with a particularly persistent salesman who refuses to leave your porch. Just 10 more seconds. Okay, fine, 10 more after that. My own willpower turned out to be a far more flexible, far more arguable thing than I'd ever given it credit for. Watching myself talk it back into compliance in real time, standing freezing in my own bathroom, was oddly instructive about how much of my life had probably been decided by exactly this kind of internal negotiation. What surprised me wasn't the discomfort itself. It was how quickly it passed and what remained once it did. A sharp, undeniable alertness, completely different from caffeine, more like my entire nervous system had been quietly reset to factory settings. I stepped out feeling like I'd actually done something difficult and survived it. A small, specific kind of confidence that doesn't show up from comfortable mornings. That particular kind of confidence is hard to manufacture any other way, I think. You can't talk yourself into it. You can't read about it convincingly enough to actually feel it. It only shows up once you've genuinely done the uncomfortable thing and confirmed firsthand that it didn't kill you, that the version of you standing on the other side of it is still completely fine, possibly more fine than before. By the time I'd dried off and gotten dressed, less than an hour had passed since the alarm. I genuinely felt like a different version of myself than the man who'd been sleeping until noon just one day earlier. Not transformed, just considerably more awake, in every sense of that word, than I'd been in longer than I wanted to admit out loud. The middle of the day used to be where my entire schedule fell apart, a chaotic scramble between a dozen half-finished tasks that all felt urgent. They somehow added up to almost nothing accomplished by the time the sun went down. This version of the day handled the middle completely differently, and it started with something almost uncomfortably simple. One task. Just one, chosen the night before, written down, the single thing that would make the entire day worth calling a success, even if absolutely nothing else got done. Not a list. Not 5 priorities competing for the same 3 hours. One task, specific enough that there was no ambiguity about whether it had actually been completed by the end of it. I'd kept to-do lists my entire adult life, the kind with 15 items by 9 in the morning, half of them carried over from the day before. A few carried over so many times they'd basically become permanent fixtures rather than actual tasks. A list with 15 items is functionally a list with 0 priorities, since everything on it is quietly competing for the exact same attention. One task removed the competition entirely. There was simply nothing left to negotiate with. This is the same exact move, I realized later, that quietly separates men who build real wealth from men who just earned good money and watch it disappear regardless. The guy with 15 financial goals running simultaneously, a little here, a little there, spread thin across every shiny opportunity, rarely builds anything that compounds into something substantial. The guy who picks one number, one priority, one account that gets fed before anything else touches it, ends up with considerably more to show for the exact same effort. Subtraction, applied to a calendar or a bank account, produces the same strange kind of leverage either way. Choosing it the night before turned out to matter considerably more than I expected. Choosing it in the moment, the way I'd always done it, meant the choice was made by whatever felt urgent in that exact second. Usually email, usually somebody else's priorities wearing a disguise that made them look like mine. Choosing it the night before meant a calmer, less reactive version of myself got to make the call, and that version consistently picked something more meaningful than the panicked morning version ever would have. The task I'd chosen the night before was something I'd been avoiding for nearly 2 months, a phone call I kept finding excellent reasons to postpone, none of which held up under any real scrutiny. Past me, exhausted and scrolling at 11 at night, had apparently been considerably braver and more honest than present me ever managed to be once the actual morning arrived with the actual phone sitting right there. I sat down to actually do the task and immediately reached for my phone out of pure muscle memory, a reflex so automatic I genuinely hadn't registered doing it until it was already in my hand. I put it back down, face away, in another room entirely. The same trick that had worked that morning applied now to an entirely different kind of distraction. It struck me, holding the phone for that brief second, how little actual decision-making had been involved in reaching for it. My hand had simply gone there, the way it apparently always did, dozens of times a day, without my conscious mind ever weighing in on whether it was actually a good idea. That single observation alone watching myself on autopilot, was worth considerably more than I expected from a single phone left sitting in another room. The first 20 minutes of actual focused work felt almost physically uncomfortable, my attention twitching toward a dozen other half-formed thoughts. The way a muscle twitches after being asked to hold a position it isn't used to holding. I kept redirecting it back gently, the way you'd redirect a distracted dog on a walk. No drama, just a quiet correction, repeated as many times as it took. Somewhere past the half-hour mark, something shifted. The twitching settled, and I dropped into a kind of focus I genuinely hadn't experienced in longer than I wanted to think about. Time stopped behaving normally. I looked up eventually, fully expecting maybe 40 minutes to have passed. I'd been sitting there, completely absorbed for considerably longer than that, the task nearly finished, my coffee gone stone cold beside me without my ever once noticing it cooling. I'd genuinely forgotten what that particular kind of absorption felt like, the sensation of disappearing entirely into a single task with no part of my attention checking the time, no part scanning for the next interruption to manage. I used to assume that kind of focus belonged to other people, some lucky category of men wired differently than me. It turns out it had just been buried under years of half-attention spread thin across a dozen things at once, waiting for one task, undisturbed, to actually let it surface. Somewhere around mid-afternoon, the whole thing nearly fell apart. Nobody warns you about this part, the inevitable dip that arrives regardless of how well the morning went, as though the day is testing whether the new version of you is actually real or just a temporary performance that collapses the moment things get genuinely difficult. The energy crash hit hard, considerably harder than I expected, after a morning that had gone better than any but morning in recent memory. My eyelids felt like they were being pulled down by something with actual physical weight. The old version of me knew exactly what came next in this scenario. A couch, a screen, an hour or two quietly disappearing into something that required zero effort and produced zero results. I sat there for a moment genuinely confused about how a morning that had felt this strong could collapse this completely by early afternoon. Some part of me had quietly assumed momentum, once built, would simply carry itself forward without needing anything further from me. That assumption turned out to be flatly wrong, and the afternoon was apparently determined to make sure I understood that as directly as possible. I genuinely sat on the edge of that couch for a solid minute, phone in hand again, the same old gravitational pull asserting itself the moment my guard dropped even slightly. Every justification arrived right on schedule. I'd already done the hard parts. I deserved a break. One episode wouldn't hurt anything. They were all individually completely reasonable arguments, and collectively, they were the exact same arguments that had quietly built the version of me I was trying to leave behind. I actually had the streaming app open, thumb hovering over a show I'd already half-watched a dozen times before, the kind of comfortable background noise that asks nothing of you and gives back roughly the same. I closed it. Not dramatically. Just a single tap, the way you'd close a tab you'd opened by accident, except this particular tab had quietly swallowed entire evenings of my life for years, without my ever once closing it on purpose. What actually broke the spell wasn't some burst of inspiration or sudden willpower. It was standing up almost mechanically and walking outside without giving myself time to negotiate further. No destination, no agenda, just movement. 15 minutes around the neighborhood in air that wasn't recycled through a living room I'd been sitting in for hours. The walk didn't fix the tiredness completely. It did something more useful than fixing it. It interrupted the spiral before the spiral had a chance to fully take hold, the same way catching a small leak early stops it from becoming a flood later. By the time I got back inside, the crash had loosened its grip enough that getting back to something productive felt difficult instead of impossible. That, it turns out, is an entirely different and considerably more manageable category of difficult. A neighbor was out trimming his hedges as I passed, gave me a nod. I returned without much enthusiasm, my legs moving more out of stubbornness than energy at that point. I wasn't thinking great thoughts on that walk. I wasn't experiencing some profound moment of clarity under an inspiring sky. I was just a tired man walking around a block for no reason that would have made sense to anyone watching, and somehow, that was exactly enough. I think this stretch of the afternoon was actually the most important part of the entire day, more than the cold shower, more than the focused work session. Simply because it was the first real test of whether any of this would survive contact with genuine resistance. Anyone can follow a routine when it feels good. The actual question was always whether I'd keep going once it stopped feeling good, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the answer was yes. I think every man who's ever actually changed something meaningful about himself has a version of this exact afternoon somewhere in the story, even if nobody talks about it on the highlight reel. The triumphant morning gets remembered. The boring 15-minute walk around a block, fighting the specific gravitational pull of a couch and a familiar show, almost never makes it into the story at all. Despite being in my own experience, the actual hinge the entire day swung on. That couch, that streaming app weren't really that different from a credit card sitting in a wallet, whispering that one purchase wouldn't hurt anything. Both offer the exact same trade, a small, immediate comfort in exchange for a slightly weaker version of whatever you were actually trying to build. The man who can close the app and stand up is more often than not the same kind of man who can put the impulse purchase back on the shelf. Underneath both moments sits the identical, unglamorous skill of declining a small reward now for a larger one later. The evening surprised me more than any other part of the day, mostly because I'd always treated evenings as the reward section. The part where discipline finally got to clock out and whatever felt good got to take over completely. This version of the evening had its own quiet structure, and somehow that structure made it feel more like a reward, not less. Dinner came first, eaten at the table instead of in front of a screen, which felt almost ceremonial after years of barely registering what I'd eaten, because my attention had been somewhere else entirely. I noticed the actual taste of the food for what felt like the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. A small, strange pleasure that had apparently been available the whole time, just drowned out by whatever I'd been watching alongside it. I ate slower than usual, partly out of habit, and partly because there was nothing competing for my attention, pulling me through the meal faster than necessary. My phone sat in the other room. The table sat in actual silence, except for the occasional clink of a fork. Somewhere around halfway through, I realized I genuinely couldn't remember the last time a meal alone had felt this much like an actual event instead of fuel consumed in passing. After dinner came a short walk, different in feeling entirely from the desperate, spiral-breaking walk earlier in the day. This one was unhurried, almost meditative, the kind of walk that exists purely to mark the transition from the working part of the day to whatever came next. No particular destination, no battle being fought against any temptation. The street looked the same as it had during the afternoon's panicked loop around the block. Same houses, same trimmed hedges. But the walk itself felt like an entirely different activity. One had been an escape from something. This one was simply a closing, the kind of unhurried lap a man takes around his own neighborhood once the day's actual work is genuinely behind him. Then a short stretch of reflection, pen and paper, nothing elaborate, just 3 honest answers to 3 honest questions. What actually went well today? What didn't? What's the one task for tomorrow? I'd expected this part to feel forced, the kind of journaling exercise people abandon within a week. It didn't feel forced. It felt like finally being asked questions nobody, including myself, had bothered asking in longer than I could remember. The handwriting itself surprised me, sloppy and unfamiliar, the way handwriting gets when you haven't used it for anything beyond signing a delivery slip in years. The actual content surprised me more. What went well wasn't the workout or the focused task, both genuinely good things. It was the 15-minute walk that broke the afternoon spiral, the part of the day I'd have been most embarrassed to mention out loud to anyone watching from the outside. Writing down tomorrow's one task felt different doing it at night than it had felt imagining it in the morning. Calmer, more honest. The version of me sitting there with a full, productive, occasionally difficult day behind him had a clearer sense of what actually mattered. The exhausted, foggy version who used to make these decisions at 6 in the morning, coffee not yet kicked in, never stood a chance by comparison. I picked tomorrow's task in under a minute. No agonizing, no second-guessing. The way a decision lands easily once you actually trust the person making it. That trust hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. It had been built quietly across one single day of mostly small, unremarkable actions, the kind that don't photograph well and don't make for an exciting highlight reel, but apparently add up to something resembling self-respect when stacked end to end. It occurred to me, closing the notebook, that the entire day had quietly operated on a kind of minimalism I'd never consciously named before. One transfer of attention to myself before the world got it. One task, one walk to break a spiral instead of a dozen scattered distractions to manage it. The same principle that builds a Fortune 1 untouched paycheck at a time apparently rebuilds a man one undistracted day at a time. Neither one seems to require very much besides the discipline to stop adding things. The phone stayed out of the bedroom again, charging in the kitchen exactly where it had charged the night before. That completed a loop that had started roughly 24 hours earlier with a man who could barely remember the last day he'd felt proud of himself. Lying there in the dark, genuinely tired in the good way instead of the hollow way, I thought about that man from the previous Tuesday. I realized, with a kind of quiet certainty I hadn't expected to feel this soon, that he and I weren't quite the same person anymore. Hold on to that thought, because there's an honest confession buried in this video's own title that I want to address directly. If you sat through this entire day with me, genuinely, thank you. This wasn't a quick list of hacks. It was one full day, hour by hour, including the parts where I nearly quit on myself completely. Subscribe to this channel if that kind of honesty matters to you, because there's a lot more real, specific content like this coming, not polished highlight reels pretending difficulty doesn't exist. I almost cut the afternoon section entirely, the streaming app, the couch, the minute where quitting felt like the only reasonable option left. It would have made for a cleaner, more inspiring video, a man who simply executes a perfect day without ever once nearly failing. That version would have been a lie, and lying about the hard part felt like exactly the kind of dishonesty this channel was built to avoid. While you're here, tell me in the comments which part of this day sounds hardest for you specifically. The cold shower, the phone out of the bedroom, the single task instead of the usual scattered list. I read these and they genuinely shape what gets covered next on this channel. If I had to guess, the phone leaving the bedroom probably terrifies more of you than the cold water does, which says something fairly specific about where most of our actual addiction sits these days. I'd rather hear it from you directly than just assume my own guess holds up across the board. Here's the honest part, the part the title of this video deliberately left out. There is no secret. There is no exclusive routine only the wealthy or the successful happen to know about, hidden behind some velvet rope the rest of us were never invited past. Everything in this video is available to literally anyone for free, starting tonight, requiring nothing except the willingness to actually do it on a day when doing it feels considerably harder than not doing it. I genuinely debated whether to even use a title like this one, knowing full well it was promising something I was about to spend the rest of the video gently taking apart. I decided it was worth the slight contradiction. I suspect a decent number of you clicked on the promise of a secret and are about to leave with something more useful than a secret. an honest map of exactly how unremarkable the actual mechanism is. The phrase, the 1% in this title, is, frankly, doing a lot of marketing work it doesn't fully deserve. The men who consistently follow something like this aren't operating from some secret financial or genetic advantage the rest of us lack. They're operating from the simple, repeatable willingness to make their bed, get cold on purpose, finish one task before checking a phone, and write 3 honest sentences before going to sleep. None of that requires money. None of it requires connections. It requires showing up on the one day it would be easiest, by far, to simply not. If anything, the genuinely successful men I've actually met, the ones whose lives look enviable from the outside, tend to be remarkably allergic to the word secret whenever it comes up in conversation. Almost every single one of them, asked directly, gives some version of the same unglamorous answer. Consistency. Showing up. Doing it again tomorrow, even though today felt hard. It's a considerably less exciting headline than the 1% secret routine, and it also happens to be true. That's the actual secret, if you insist on calling it one. Not access, not information nobody else has. Just doing the unremarkable thing on the day you'd rather not, often enough that doing it eventually stops requiring a decision at all. Here's the provocation I want to leave you with, the one that took me considerably longer to fully understand than it should have. We've been trained almost from childhood to measure a successful life by what it accumulates. More money, more possessions, more achievements stacked visibly on a shelf for everyone to admire. The men who actually live the way this video describes aren't accumulating anything during these 24 hours. They're subtracting relentlessly all day long. Fewer tasks, fewer inputs, fewer comforts negotiated for in weak moments. The morning had one task instead of 15. The phone had one location instead of constant proximity. The evening had 3 honest questions instead of an elaborate ritual nobody could actually sustain. Success, looked at this closely, starts looking considerably less like a mountain you climb. It starts looking considerably more like a room you clear out, one unnecessary thing at a time, until what's left is finally light enough to carry somewhere worth going. I'd rather tell you that plainly than dress it up as something more mysterious. The mysterious version, the one that implies you're missing some hidden lever, tends to leave people waiting around for a secret that was never going to arrive. The boring version, the one I've just spent this entire video walking you through hour by hour, has a considerable advantage. It's actually true, and it's actually available to you starting at whatever time you happen to wake up tomorrow. Remember that Tuesday I mentioned at the start? Noon, dead phone, dishes piled in the sink. A man who couldn't remember the last day he'd felt proud of himself. I think about that Tuesday often. Not with shame exactly, more with a kind of distant curiosity, the way you'd look at an old photo of yourself and barely recognize the posture. I genuinely don't know what specifically tipped me over that day, why that particular Tuesday became the one I finally couldn't ignore after presumably dozens of similar ones had come and gone without sparking anything at all. Maybe there's no single answer. Maybe a man just accumulates enough quiet evidence against himself until, on some completely unremarkable afternoon, the case finally closes and a verdict gets reached. The 24 hours I described in this video wasn't a one-time event. It became more or less a template, repeated imperfectly, adjusted constantly, but recognizable in its bones on most days since. Some mornings the cold shower gets cut shorter than it should. Some evenings the journaling gets skipped entirely because exhaustion wins that particular negotiation. The template survives the imperfection. That's sort of the entire point of building a template in the first place. I think a lot of the bigger wins I've had since that Tuesday, in plenty of areas that have nothing to do with mornings or cold water, owe a meaningful amount to this exact day. Oddly enough, even though the connection isn't obvious on the surface. A man who can win a fight against a couch on a bad Tuesday afternoon is, generally speaking, A man who eventually wins quite a few other fights, too. I won't pretend every day since has gone this well. There have been Tuesdays since that one, plenty of them, where the old gravitational pull toward the couch and the scattered list and the phone in bed won clean and decisive victories. The difference now isn't that I've become immune to those days. It's that I know, with genuine certainty earned the hard way, exactly what a single different day looks like, and exactly how to build another one whenever I'm ready to. A bad week doesn't unravel me the way it used to either, which I think is the actual prize hiding inside all of this. Old me, knocked off track, used to treat the entire effort as ruined. The streak broken, may as well start fresh next month or next year. New me just goes back to that same 24-hour template the very next morning. No ceremony required. No extended apology tour to myself necessary first. The man writing this script still negotiates with himself in cold showers. He still occasionally reaches for his phone out of pure muscle memory before catching himself. None of these habits ever became effortless, and I'd be lying if I told you they had. What changed is considerably simpler than effortlessness. I stopped being surprised by the resistance and stopped treating its presence as proof that something was going wrong. That single shift, expecting the resistance instead of being ambushed by it every single time, has probably done more for my consistency than any individual habit on this list. Resistance stopped meaning failure. It started meaning Tuesday, the same way weather happens whether or not you've checked the forecast. Something to plan around instead of something to be shocked by every time it shows up uninvited. If you take nothing else from this entire video, take this. Stop asking what you need to add to your life to finally fix it. Most men I know, myself included for years, default to that question automatically. A new app, a new system, a new piece of equipment that'll supposedly make the difference this time. Ask instead what you could remove. One distraction. One unnecessary task. One comfort you've been negotiating with yourself about for entirely too long. The room gets lighter every single time you take something out of it, never once by adding something new in. If this single day found you somewhere honest tonight, do a few things before you go. Follow this channel because there's more of this kind of specific, lived-in honesty coming, not generic motivation dressed up as a routine. Share this with someone who needs a reset, not a lecture. The friend who's been talking about getting back on track for months without ever quite starting. The guy who would benefit from seeing exactly what one full day actually looks like instead of a vague idea of one. Leave a comment telling me whether you're trying this and which part you're starting with. Tell me what you want covered next, because that's genuinely how this channel keeps getting built, one honest, repeatable day at a time. I'll see you in the next one.